The evening my lawyer suddenly texted me. "Call me immediately." I was standing alone in the glass office I built more than 3 decades ago, watching the last stretch of sunlight spill across rows of polished vehicles that carried my company's emblem. And I had no understanding that within minutes my own daughter would attempt to remove me from the life I created through a legal document designed to declare me incapable. My name is Richard Halbrook. I am 63 years old, and I built Halbrook Automotive in Columbus, Ohio from a single repair garage that smelled of oil and metal during the years when my wife passed away and left me, with a 5-year-old daughter and a future that could have easily collapsed under the weight of grief and unpaid bills. I did not inherit a business, and I did not receive help from investors who believed in dreams, because every expansion, every contract, and every employee hired was supported by nights without sleep and decisions that carried personal risk no one else could see. That 5-year-old girl was Vanessa Halbrook, and she was the reason I refused to surrender when exhaustion pressed against my spine and doubt whispered that stability was no longer possible. She grew up inside that garage before it became a dealership. She completed homework at the same metal desk where I balanced accounts, and she learned the language of invoices and negotiation before she understood algebra. I believed she understood the cost of everything we built together, and I believed that understanding would protect the integrity of our future. On that evening, the dealership lot below, my office was quiet and orderly, the final customers long gone, and the fluorescent lights reflected across the windshields in long controlled streaks that felt like silent acknowledgments of discipline and patience. I remember feeling calm in a way that only comes to a man who knows he has protected his responsibilities carefully, because I had just finalized a fleet contract that ensured stability for another year, and I allowed myself a rare moment of satisfaction. Then my phone vibrated against the surface of my desk, and the small screen displayed the name Gerald Whitaker, the attorney, who has represented me for more than 20 years with steady judgment and no tolerance for drama. The message beneath his name was brief, but urgent, and it read, "Call me immediately. This cannot wait." There are moments when instinct speaks, before logic has time to respond, and as I read those words I felt a quiet pressure form behind my ribs. That did not belong to age or fatigue, because Gerald does not send messages filled with urgency unless the situation requires immediate clarity. I called him before allowing myself to imagine possibilities, and he answered. On the first ring, with a tone that was controlled yet unusually tense, he instructed me to listen carefully, and he explained that a petition had been filed that morning in Franklin County, probate court requesting emergency guardianship over my financial authority and executive control of Halbrook Automotive. The words felt distant at first, as though they were being spoken about another man in another city, because guardianship is a legal mechanism used when an individual can no longer manage his own affairs, and I had been reviewing quarterly projections just hours earlier with full precision and awareness. Gerald continued with deliberate clarity, and he told me that the petitioner listed on the documents was Vanessa Halbrook. The silence that followed his statement carried more weight than any market crash or economic downturn I have faced, because business competition prepares you for conflict, but it does not prepare you for betrayal that arrives in the form of your own child's signature on a legal filing. He explained that the petition alleged cognitive decline, poor financial judgment, and increasing instability in executive decisions, and it requested temporary oversight of company assets in order to prevent potential mismanagement. He added that supporting documents had been submitted, including financial summaries and signed statements that appeared to carry my signature, and at that moment disbelief pressed so heavily against my chest that I had to steady myself against the desk. I have signed thousands of documents in my lifetime, and my signature is not something I forget placing on paper, because it represents accountability and commitment. I had never authorized any statement admitting instability, and I had never consented to external oversight of the company that bears my name. The realization that my signature might have been replicated without my consent introduced a word into my mind that I had never associated with my family, and that word was forgery. Gerald informed me that preliminary review suggested inconsistencies in the documents, including irregular metadata timestamps and unusual spacing within the signatures. That could indicate digital manipulation. He emphasized the seriousness of the filing, because if the court granted temporary guardianship pending review, I could be restricted from making executive decisions until a formal cognitive evaluation was completed. The thought of being temporarily removed from authority over contracts I negotiated and employees who depend on my leadership created a quiet but powerful shift inside me. 3 nights earlier, Vanessa had sat at my dining table discussing expansion strategies and inventory adjustments, and she had asked thoughtful questions about market transitions without revealing even a trace of legal action underway. She had hugged me before leaving, and she had spoken about the importance of protecting family legacy, and now that same legacy was being positioned in court as something from which she needed to protect me. Gerald asked whether Vanessa had expressed concern about my capacity in recent months, and I recalled subtle remarks that, at the time, sounded like professional curiosity, because she had mentioned succession planning and the importance of preparing for generational transition. I heard those comments as responsible foresight rather than preparation for removal. But in the context of a filed petition, they began to resemble reconnaissance rather than conversation. He then explained that attached to the petition was a transitional management outline that listed Caleb Thornton as a proposed strategic advisor during the oversight period. Caleb is Vanessa's son, and although he possesses ambition, he has not demonstrated the discipline required to sustain executive authority. The inclusion of his name suggested that this action extended beyond concern for my well-being and entered the territory of coordinated restructuring. After the call ended, I remained standing in my office while the light outside dimmed into evening, and I studied the rows of vehicles that symbolized decades of calculated growth. Each expansion decision carried the memory of sacrifice, and each successful year reflected restraint during moments when greed could have destroyed stability. I considered the possibility that my daughter believed she was accelerating an inevitable transition, and I asked myself when she began to see me as an obstacle rather than as the architect of her opportunity. That night at home, I sat in the quiet living room surrounded by framed photographs that documented Vanessa's childhood and academic achievements, and I struggled to reconcile those images with the legal reality unfolding in probate court. I remembered carrying her from the office to the car when she fell asleep during late nights at the garage, and I remembered promising her that she would never experience instability, as I had during my youth. The idea that she now considered me unstable carried a sting that no competitor could ever replicate. The following morning, I met Gerald at his downtown office, where copies of the petition lay spread across a polished conference table, like a formal accusation disguised as protection. We reviewed each claim in detail, and I recognized fragments of truth rearranged into a narrative designed to suggest decline. A delayed vendor payment caused by a banking holiday was described as financial confusion, and a conservative inventory decision was framed as fear-driven stagnation. Context had been removed, and intent had been reinterpreted. The signatures attached to the statements were close to mine but lacked the natural flow created by muscle memory, and Gerald confirmed that forensic analysis would likely reveal digital overlay before print reproduction. System access logs indicated that internal company data had been downloaded during hours when I was not present, and the user credentials associated with those downloads aligned with Vanessa's advisory account. The pattern that emerged was not emotional impulse, but calculated preparation. Gerald advised immediate commissioning of an independent cognitive evaluation to establish documented clarity, and he recommended a comprehensive financial audit to dismantle allegations of mismanagement. He also emphasized the importance of silence until a strategic response could be structured, because confrontation without preparation would only strengthen the narrative that I was reacting emotionally rather than acting rationally. As I drove back to the dealership that afternoon, I realized that this conflict was not solely about legal control, because it represented a deeper shift in how my daughter perceived authority and inheritance. Age had become her justification for intervention, and ambition had become her motivation for acceleration. I had always planned to structure succession responsibly, but I had never intended to be removed through manipulation. That evening, Vanessa called casually to discuss weekend dinner arrangements, and her tone remained steady and composed, as though nothing unusual had occurred. I listened carefully for hesitation or remorse, but I detected only confidence, and that confidence suggested she believed her actions were either justified or undetectable. I responded politely and ended the conversation without revealing awareness because clarity sometimes requires patience rather than immediate exposure. When I returned to the office window, once more that night, the lot appeared unchanged beneath the glow of security lights, yet I understood that the foundation beneath my life had shifted quietly. The message from my lawyer had not only informed me of a guardianship petition, but it had revealed that my daughter had already begun constructing a future in which my authority was optional. Standing there in silence, I made a decision that would define everything that followed, because I understood with complete certainty that experience is not weakness and that legacy is not surrendered without defense. If Vanessa believed that I would accept removal quietly in the name of transition, she was about to discover that the same discipline which built this company would now be used to protect it. Standing at the window that night, watching the security lights cast long reflections across the polished hoods below, I understood with unsettling clarity that the battle in front of me would not be loud or impulsive because it had already been planned in silence, and anything built in silence must be dismantled with greater precision than anger could ever provide. The following morning began not with confrontation, but with documentation. I met Gerald Whittaker again in his office before sunrise, and this time we were joined by Olivia Kern, a forensic financial analyst whose calm demeanor suggested she had seen families fracture over less money than I generated in a single quarter. The room felt less like a law office and more like a control center, because every document on the table represented not just a legal claim, but an attempted narrative shift about who I was and what I was capable of managing. Olivia began by reviewing internal access, logs from Halbrook Automotive's executive system, and the timestamps revealed something I could not dismiss as coincidence. Over the previous 4 months, financial summaries had been downloaded. Late in the evening under advisory, credentials assigned to Vanessa, and although she had limited access for oversight purposes, the frequency and volume of downloads exceeded normal review patterns. She had not been browsing casually, because she had been collecting. The downloaded reports included vendor payment schedules, projected expansion models, executive compensation breakdowns, and debt-to-equity ratio analyses that required contextual interpretation to avoid misrepresentation. When isolated from their broader framework, those figures could be rearranged to suggest instability, and the petition filed in probate court did precisely that by extracting selective data and presenting it without the operational explanations that made them rational decisions. Gerald turned his attention to the signatures attached to the sworn statements, and he explained that forensic comparison software had already identified pixel layering inconsistent with organic pen movement. The signatures appeared genuine at first glance, but under magnification, the ink patterns revealed digital overlay characteristics, which meant someone had scanned an authentic signature and manipulated it into new documents. The realization that my own name had been reproduced without consent introduced a level of betrayal that felt colder than any courtroom accusation. Olivia then presented a timeline that shifted the situation from troubling to calculated. Approximately 6 weeks before the guardianship petition was filed, an internal document titled Transitional Authority Framework had been drafted on a personal device associated with Caleb Thornton, Vanessa's son. Although the document had not been formally submitted to company servers, fragments of its structure appeared in the petition's proposed management outline. The connection suggested coordination, not concern. Caleb's name appearing as proposed strategic advisor during a temporary oversight period was not an afterthought, because it indicated that control was the objective from the beginning. Caleb had expressed frustration in the past about not receiving executive authority within the company, and I had explained repeatedly that leadership requires experience earned through accountability, rather than granted through bloodline. His impatience had always been visible, but I had underestimated its influence. As Olivia continued outlining metadata correlations between downloaded reports and petition language, I felt something more complex than anger settle inside me. Anger is immediate and loud, but this feeling was controlled and deliberate, because it carried the understanding that my daughter had not acted impulsively. She had analyzed, prepared, and constructed a legal strategy that portrayed me as declining while positioning herself as protective and forward-thinking. Gerald reviewed the language of the petition again, and he pointed out phrases designed to evoke judicial sympathy Words such as vulnerable, protective oversight, and safeguarding legacy were woven carefully between allegations of cognitive lapse. The document did not attack me directly, with aggression, because it suggested compassion while simultaneously requesting authority. It was crafted to appear responsible rather than opportunistic. I asked a question that lingered between professional analysis and personal pain. And I wanted to know whether the court would view such a petition as credible without immediate proof of incapacity. Gerald explained that emergency guardianship requests are evaluated based on preliminary plausibility, and although the court would require evidence before granting long-term control, temporary restrictions could be imposed if concern appeared reasonable. That possibility reinforced the urgency of dismantling the narrative before it solidified. We commissioned an independent neurological and cognitive evaluation, scheduled within the week, not because I doubted my clarity, but because documentation would neutralize speculation. We initiated a comprehensive third-party financial audit to confirm stability and to contextualize every decision that had been selectively distorted in the petition. Preparation became our strategy because silence combined with evidence is more powerful than confrontation without proof. As the meeting concluded, Gerald reminded me that emotional reaction would serve Vanessa's case because visible outrage could be reframed as instability. I understood the discipline required because decades in business taught me that restraint during accusation preserves authority. Nevertheless, beneath my composed exterior lay the difficult truth that this conflict was not a negotiation with a competitor, but a legal maneuver initiated by my own child. Later that afternoon, Vanessa invited me to dinner at her home, and her tone during the call remained steady and almost affectionate, which indicated either confidence in her strategy or belief that I remained unaware. I accepted the invitation without hesitation because observation often reveals more than interrogation. When I arrived, the house was warm and decorated, with framed photographs that documented family milestones, and nothing in the environment suggested tension. Caleb greeted me with measured enthusiasm, and he spoke about market shifts in the automotive industry with a tone that sounded rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Vanessa discussed holiday travel plans and community events, and throughout the evening she maintained direct eye contact without a trace of visible guilt. Her composure disturbed me more than anger would have, because it demonstrated conviction in her course of action. As conversation drifted toward business, Vanessa mentioned that long-term sustainability requires structured transition, and she spoke about the importance of preparing leadership for generational continuity. The phrasing mirrored language from the petition almost exactly, and I realized that what once appeared to be thoughtful conversation had been groundwork for legal positioning. Her ability to repeat those ideas without hesitation suggested internal justification rather than doubt. I responded with calm acknowledgement and redirected discussion toward current performance metrics, outlining recent growth and stable projections. Caleb listened attentively, but his questions focused not on operations, but on authority distribution, and he asked hypothetically how executive roles might be reorganized during periods of transition. The pattern was consistent because they were not discussing improvement but reallocation. Driving home that evening, I recognized that their behavior confirmed coordination because consistency between legal language and dinner conversation cannot be accidental. They believed that I was gradually approaching irrelevance, and they had chosen acceleration over patience. The most difficult realization was not that they sought control, but that they believed they were entitled to it. The cognitive evaluation took place 2 days later in a quiet medical office, where a specialist conducted extensive testing covering memory retention, executive reasoning, problem-solving, and spatial awareness. I answered each question without strain, and I completed complex analytical exercises that would challenge professionals half my age. The evaluation concluded with the physician expressing no indication of cognitive impairment, and documentation would soon formalize that conclusion. Simultaneously, the independent financial audit began reviewing every claim listed in the petition, and preliminary findings confirmed stable liquidity ratios, consistent vendor payments, and rational inventory management strategies aligned with broader market forecasts. Each allegation presented as instability unraveled under contextual scrutiny. Because selective omission cannot survive comprehensive analysis, Olivia contacted Gerald with further findings that intensified the situation. Digital forensics traced document draft revisions to a shared cloud account. Associated with Vanessa's personal email, and version history revealed edits matching phrasing in the final petition. The evidence did not merely suggest concern but deliberate composition. Caleb's device metadata indicated preliminary formatting of the transitional authority framework weeks before filing, reinforcing the coordinated nature of the attempt. The case was evolving beyond a guardianship dispute into potential fraudulent misrepresentation, because forged signatures and manipulated documents introduce legal consequences far more severe than succession disagreements. Gerald advised that we prepare not only to defend against guardianship, but also to initiate counteraction if fraud could be established conclusively. The shift from defense to offense required careful calculation. Throughout this period, Vanessa continued communicating normally, asking about minor operational updates and family gatherings as though no court filing existed. Her confidence suggested she believed the legal system would interpret her actions as protective rather than predatory. That belief may have originated from genuine conviction, but conviction does not neutralize accountability. Each evening I returned to my office and reviewed historical photographs of the original garage where this entire journey began, and I reminded myself that legacy is not inherited automatically, but protected deliberately. The narrative forming in court attempted to recast me as a man drifting beyond competence, yet the reality was that I remained fully aware of every operational variable influencing Halbrook Automotive. The more evidence we gathered, the clearer the pattern became. Because Vanessa had constructed a case designed to create temporary leverage, and temporary leverage could evolve into permanent restructuring if unchallenged. Caleb's inclusion positioned him as beneficiary of accelerated transition, and the combination of forged signatures and selective data suggested awareness that persuasion alone would not secure control. As preparation rather than confrontation, I felt a transformation within myself that did not resemble bitterness, but rather sharpened focus. I had once believed that succession would be a moment of pride shared willingly, but now I understood that authority, relinquished under manipulation, would not honor the years invested in building this enterprise. If transition occurred, it would occur through earned trust and transparent governance, not through engineered doubt. The court hearing date approached steadily, and our documentation folder expanded with certified evaluations, forensic analyses, and audit confirmations that dismantled each claim piece by piece. What began as a message instructing me to call immediately had evolved into a comprehensive strategy to expose not only false allegations, but the intention behind them. Standing again at the office window, one evening, observing employees' close departments with routine efficiency, I recognized that leadership during crisis requires calm consistency. My daughter may have believed that age diminished clarity, but the preparation unfolding around me demonstrated that experience deepens resilience. The confrontation awaiting us in court would not be emotional spectacle but structured revelation, and when that moment arrived, the narrative she crafted would meet evidence she did not anticipate. The strategy behind her smile was beginning to unravel, and I understood with steady certainty that the next phase would determine not only control of my company, but the future of my family's name. The morning of the hearing arrived with a stillness that felt almost artificial, as though the city itself had paused to observe whether a daughter could quietly remove her father from authority without consequence. And as I adjusted my jacket before leaving for the courthouse, I understood that what would unfold inside that room would determine not only legal control of Halbrook Automotive, but the integrity of my name. Franklin County Probate Court stands in a building that carries the weight of countless family disputes hidden beneath polished floors and controlled language, and as I entered with Gerald Whitaker and Olivia Kern beside me, I felt no confusion or hesitation, because every document in our possession had been prepared with discipline and every accusation had been studied until its weakness became visible. The hallway outside the courtroom carried soft echoes of conversation, and among those voices I recognized Vanessa's measured tone speaking to her attorney with the same composure she displayed at family dinners. When she saw me, her expression did not collapse into guilt or fear, because she maintained the calm confidence of someone who believes her position is justified. Caleb stood beside her, in a tailored suit that seemed chosen for credibility rather than comfort, and his posture suggested expectation rather than doubt. They did not look like conspirators in their own minds, because they looked like individuals, preparing to assume control. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt restrained, yet charged, because guardianship cases carry emotional undertones, even when wrapped in professional language. The judge reviewed preliminary filings with neutral focus, and when proceedings began, Vanessa's attorney presented the petition with carefully constructed concern. The narrative emphasized protection, sustainability, and the urgency of safeguarding a valuable enterprise from potential decline. Each phrase was delivered with polished clarity, and the framing avoided direct insult while subtly suggesting that age had introduced instability. I listened as selected financial summaries were displayed on the screen, and I recognized how isolation of numbers could distort perception. A temporary inventory reduction during market fluctuation was presented as hesitation driven by confusion. A strategic delay in expansion was characterized as fear of innovation. The petition described moments of reflection as evidence of cognitive slowing, and it cited conversations where I questioned aggressive growth as proof of declining adaptability. Vanessa's written statement was read aloud, and it described a daughter concerned about her father's increasing forgetfulness and emotional rigidity. The words were crafted to evoke sympathy because they portrayed her as reluctant, but responsible. Hearing those sentences attributed to her voice created a sensation deeper than anger, because they did not reflect misunderstanding but reinterpretation. She had reframed my caution as decline and my discipline as limitation. When Gerald rose to respond, he did not begin with accusation, but with documentation. He presented the independent neurological evaluation completed days earlier, and the certified report detailed comprehensive cognitive testing that demonstrated executive functioning within strong parameters. The physician's conclusions left no ambiguity, because they stated explicitly that there was no evidence of impairment affecting decision-making capacity. The judge reviewed the report carefully, and a subtle shift occurred in the room. Guardianship proceedings rely heavily on demonstrable incapacity, and the absence of medical support weakened the petition's foundation immediately. However, the matter extended beyond cognitive evaluation, because allegations of financial mismanagement still required response. Olivia then presented findings from the independent financial audit, and she explained in structured detail how each cited example in the petition had been extracted without context. Vendor payment schedules were shown in full sequence, revealing no pattern of delay beyond routine banking intervals. Inventory adjustments were mapped against market volatility charts, demonstrating strategic alignment rather than impulsive retreat. Profit margins and liquidity ratios were displayed transparently, and the data reflected stability rather than decline. The courtroom grew quieter as the selective narrative began to unravel under comprehensive analysis. Yet the most significant moment had not arrived, because documentation alone addresses misinterpretation, but it does not address intent. Gerald then introduced forensic analysis of the signatures attached to the sworn statements included in the petition. Under magnified comparison, the differences between my authentic signature and the submitted versions became visible. Pressure inconsistencies, unnatural spacing, and digital layering patterns were explained methodically, and the forensic specialist testified that the signatures exhibited characteristics consistent with digital overlay rather than organic execution. The word forgery entered the record not as accusation but as technical assessment. Vanessa's attorney objected, suggesting that similarities could result from scanned authorization or clerical reproduction, but metadata logs were then presented, showing document creation timelines inconsistent with legitimate administrative processing. The timestamps revealed draft revisions occurring on devices associated with Vanessa's personal email account, and version history indicated progressive edits leading to the final petition language. Caleb's device records were introduced next, and although he was not the primary petitioner, the data connected him to the creation of a transitional authority framework weeks before filing. The document's structure mirrored the management outline proposed in the guardianship request, and its formatting history demonstrated deliberate preparation. The narrative shifted subtly from concern to coordination. I observed Vanessa's posture during these revelations, and for the first time, her composure showed strain. Her confidence had rested on the assumption that her framing would dominate perception. But evidence introduces weight that rhetoric cannot easily counterbalance. The judge's questions grew more pointed, focusing on how supporting documents had been prepared and why draft histories aligned with personal accounts rather than neutral administrative channels. As proceedings continued, the courtroom dynamic transformed from examination of my capacity to scrutiny of the petition's construction. Guardianship law prioritizes protection, but it does not tolerate manipulation. The judge requested clarification regarding the origin of the signed statements, and when Vanessa's counsel could not provide direct documentation of witnessed execution, the tension within the room intensified. I sat quietly throughout the exchange, not because I lacked emotion, but because reaction would dilute the clarity. Unfolding before us, the humiliation of being portrayed as declining had been sharp, yet watching the narrative unravel under objective analysis introduced a different sensation. It was not triumph, because this was still my daughter, seated across from me, but it was recognition that truth carries its own momentum when supported by evidence. The judge ordered a temporary pause to review forensic materials more closely, and during that recess, the courtroom atmosphere felt heavier than before. Conversations between legal teams were hushed but urgent, and I noticed Caleb's earlier certainty replaced by visible tension. Vanessa avoided my gaze, perhaps understanding that the structure she built was now being examined at its foundation. When proceedings resumed, the judge addressed the authenticity concerns directly and stated that serious questions had arisen regarding the integrity of submitted documents. The guardianship petition would not be granted pending further investigation, and the court ordered expanded review into potential misrepresentation within the filing. The language was measured, but the implication was unmistakable. What had begun as an attempt to restrict my authority was evolving into inquiry regarding fraudulent documentation. The narrative Vanessa constructed to portray herself as protective was now being examined for intentional distortion. The shift in power within that courtroom was subtle yet decisive because once credibility fractures, recovery becomes difficult. As we exited the courtroom that afternoon, the sunlight outside felt sharper than before and the building steps seemed longer. Vanessa walked ahead with her attorney, her pace brisk but no longer composed. Caleb followed close behind, and neither attempted conversation. I did not call out to them, because confrontation in that moment would have satisfied emotion, but undermined strategy. Gerald spoke quietly as we descended the steps, explaining that the court's directive opened the possibility of referral for further investigation if evidence of forgery and intentional misrepresentation was confirmed. He advised patience, because legal processes move deliberately, but he acknowledged that the direction of the case had shifted significantly. Driving back toward the dealership, I reflected on the transformation that had occurred within a single morning. The attempt to present me as incapable had exposed coordinated planning that extended beyond filial concern. My daughter's strategy relied on perception, yet perception cannot survive sustained exposure to verified fact. At the office that evening, employees greeted me with routine respect, unaware of the depth of conflict unfolding behind formal proceedings. I walked through each department with steady steps, conscious that leadership during uncertainty requires visible calm. Rumors would eventually surface, because court records are public, but the foundation of Halbrook Automotive remained intact. As dusk settled again over the lot, I stood by the window where this journey began days earlier with a single urgent message. The security lights illuminated vehicles, aligned with precision, and I considered how easily legacy can be targeted when authority appears vulnerable. Yet vulnerability had been assumed rather than proven, and assumption had now encountered resistance. Looking out across the quiet lot, I understood that the conflict had moved beyond family disagreement into the realm of accountability. Experience had guided my restraint, and evidence had begun dismantling the structure built against me. The masks that entered that courtroom with confidence had begun to crack, and once cracks appear under public light, concealment becomes impossible. The next phase would not simply determine whether I retained control of my company, because that outcome was already becoming clear. It would determine whether those who attempted to remove me would face consequences proportionate to the methods they chose. And as the night deepened around the dealership that bears my name, I recognized that the battle was no longer about defending capacity, but about confronting intention. The weeks following the courtroom session felt like walking a tightrope suspended over both pride and betrayal. Each day brought updates from Gerald and Olivia, and each piece of information confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Vanessa Halbrook and her son Caleb had overstepped the boundaries of legality in their attempt to seize control. Documents, emails, and digital metadata that once seemed innocuous now formed a trail that demonstrated deliberate manipulation, forgery, and coordination. I spent mornings in my office, reviewing financial statements and executive reports with the calm focus that decades of experience had instilled. Each number, each ledger entry was a testament not only to my competence, but to the discipline that had guided every decision I had ever made. It was ironic that my daughter, raised in the environment of accountability, I had cultivated, had chosen deception rather than discussion because she had never lacked knowledge or opportunity. Her betrayal was deliberate. The court called for the final hearing, and I entered with Gerald and Olivia, prepared not just to defend, but to demonstrate incontrovertible evidence of wrongdoing. Vanessa and Caleb arrived as expected, carrying an air of composure that had begun to falter under subtle hints of investigation. The judge reviewed the preliminary findings and requested detailed explanations regarding the discrepancies in submitted documents, the inconsistencies in signatures, and the metadata trails, linking both Vanessa and Caleb to drafts and revisions of the petition. Vanessa's attorney attempted to downplay the evidence, suggesting clerical errors and administrative miscommunication. Caleb remained silent, his prior confidence replaced with a nervous rigidity that betrayed understanding of the exposure they now faced. Gerald presented forensic reports, showing side-by-side comparisons of authentic signatures versus manipulated documents. Digital layers, pressure inconsistencies, and metadata irregularities left no room for doubt. Next, Olivia presented the audit results in clear, precise terms. Every claim of financial mismanagement that Vanessa had filed in court was dissected, contextualized, and corrected. Vendor payments were on schedule. Inventory strategies were justified with market comparisons, and executive decisions followed logical patterns consistent with a well-managed company. The attempt to create the illusion of incompetence collapsed entirely. Under factual review, when Gerald spoke about the legal implications of document manipulation, the courtroom atmosphere shifted decisively. He explained that forging a signature to gain control of corporate assets constitutes a criminal offense. The judge listened intently, and the seriousness of the accusation became evident in the subtle reactions of Vanessa and Caleb. For the first time, their carefully maintained composure faltered. Evidence of deliberate falsification, combined with the pattern of coordination between mother and son, left the court with no ambiguity. Vanessa's strategy, which had relied on portraying herself as protective and responsible, unraveled entirely. It became clear that the guardianship petition was not a matter of concern for my well-being, but a calculated attempt to appropriate my company and property under false pretenses. The judge issued a formal declaration, rejecting the guardianship petition, citing lack of evidence for incapacity, and additionally referred the matter to the district attorney for further investigation into potential fraud and forgery. Vanessa's attorney could offer no defense sufficient to counteract the objective documentation presented, and Caleb's earlier involvement was explicitly noted in the report. I remained seated through the final moments of the hearing, aware that the emotional weight of the courtroom was heavy, not just because of legal victory, but because of the recognition of personal betrayal. Vanessa's expression shifted from controlled confidence to visible realization of the consequences she had invited. Caleb's nervous posture mirrored that realization. Their attempt to override experience and integrity with manipulation had failed spectacularly. After the court session, Gerald and Olivia guided me through the remaining procedural steps to secure Halbrook Automotive and all associated assets. Each action reinforced not only my legal authority, but the principle that responsibility earned cannot be undermined by deceit. Vanessa and Caleb were now facing legal review for falsification, and the ramifications extended beyond mere dismissal of the guardianship petition. Their actions had placed them squarely in the path of accountability. Returning to the office later that evening, I walked through the familiar rows of vehicles and reflected on the journey. I had faced market crashes, competitive sabotage, and personal loss, but nothing compared to the betrayal of someone who should have understood the value of discipline, sacrifice, and integrity. The satisfaction I felt was not petty vengeance, but recognition that justice, once earned through preparation and evidence, is unequivocal. That night I sat alone in the quiet office, remembering my wife and the early days. When Vanessa was a child, tracing her small fingers over blueprints and spreadsheets, I realized that the true victory lay not only in protecting the company and property, but in reaffirming principles I had lived by for decades: transparency, accountability, and patience. Betrayal can be devastating, but when confronted with precision, preparation, and clarity, it reveals itself entirely. Vanessa and Caleb were now facing the consequences of their choices. The attempt to manipulate, to deceive, and to seize what was not theirs had been halted completely. The district attorney's investigation ensured that neither could escape legal scrutiny. Their entitlement had collided with reality. And in that collision, authority, experience, and truth prevailed. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling a rare combination of relief and emotional closure. The company remained mine, and the lessons of decades were intact. I had protected what I built, not through force but through discipline, strategic patience, and the unwavering commitment to truth. Standing once more at the office window, looking across the polished fleet beneath the security lights, I understood the depth of victory. The emotional toll of betrayal had been severe, but the consequences for Vanessa and Caleb were equally severe. Justice had been executed not with anger, but with precision and integrity. The story that began with a single, urgent message had concluded with full vindication. My daughter and grandson had been trapped in their own web of deception, and I, Richard Halbrook, 63 years old, had preserved not only my company and property, but the principle that integrity cannot be subverted by ambition or manipulation. In the silence of the office, the weight of decades of sacrifice and experience settled like a quiet crown, and I finally allowed myself to feel the profound satisfaction of triumph earned, betrayal corrected, and justice served. Halbrook Automotive remained my legacy, my authority intact, and my family would remember the lesson of accountability long after the courtroom doors closed. So let me ask you, have you ever faced betrayal from someone you trusted the most? Comment below, how did you handle it?